Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Eat NATO for Breakfast, your anti-NATO weekly show. Today is our 19th program. We feel that on our journey together, we have been having an ongoing conversation about global repercussions and how things are different in multiple terms in the global south. And with this process of global NATO that follows this US strategy to maintain global domination, we see NATO countries following Biden's path. But it is not the same everywhere, and that's okay and good. For example, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, they are more concerned about the direct impact of the war and Russian sanctions on their populations and economies, like food scarcity, energy crisis, etc. We see that this Cold War mentality is not affecting all countries in the same way. It is significant that, for example, Macky Sall, the president of Senegal and chairperson of the African Union, where several of its members' countries face an enormous humanitarian crisis, said, anti-Russia sanctions have made this situation worse. Now we do not have access to grain from Russia, primarily wheat. And most importantly, we do not have access to fertilizer. The situation was bad, and now it has become worse, creating a threat to food security in Africa. Today we feel more at home than ever. To talk about all these important issues, we have here today with us Prasanth from People's Dispatch, our partner and host at Eat NATO for Breakfast, a great journalist and activist that always brings up an accurate and global and specific analysis, and always with a really great capacity to contextualize the processes that we are living. How are you today, Prasanth? It is weird to welcome you to People's Dispatch, so I won't do it. And it's even more difficult to talk for the second week in a row with a journalist interviewing the interviewer. So let's go directly to the breakfast question. What are you having for breakfast today?
Stop. For once, we don't have to ask the breakfast question. For once, we are not actually making people get up early. Think of Eugene last week, who had to get up at 4:30 or something horrible like that. After 19 shows, we have finally learned that we make better friends, that the only way to make friends is by not making them get up early. Since you're speaking to us from India, tell us, which meal are you missing just because you're talking to us?
No. I took my preparations. I had lunch an hour in advance. As you know, one has to be very particular about these kind of things, but lunch was good. So thank you, both of you, for inviting me to the show. It's been a really interesting trajectory from how we saw earlier discussed this show in the beginnings, and then to see the wide variety of guests who have sort of come, the immense variety of perspectives that you have brought together. It's been a really educating experience for all of us as well. So really excited about the show, really excited about the last few episodes also, because the NATO conference coming up. So, and I think what this show has done has been quite unique in terms of very exclusive body of work, which is quite unprecedented. So cheers to both of you, cheers to all of us, and thank you once again.
Oh, thank you. That feels really, really nice. One of the puzzle pieces that we have not talked about, and this is why you are here, is India. It is one of the largest countries in the world, and one that is not often, we have to admit this, not often considered a full member of the international community from sort of the European perspective. It's kind of embarrassing that in Europe we don't hear so much about India. For example, if we remember last year or the previous years, this massive wave of strikes, the farmer strikes that went on for like a year or something, and this process, like this really powerful process, and the solidarity that came from all over India for the farmers, that was something that was so marginal here, that was so not reported on. It was, in fact, People's Dispatch that sort of brought this to us and to our attention here in Europe, even to people who are generally interested in issues of the global south and of especially resistance, felt that that it was really underreported for its massive impact that it had. We'll put in the chat a little link, just some overview for people who, for some reason, are listening right now but still don't know what the farmers' strike was all about. You should know. But now big things are happening also in terms of contradictions and balances. Lots of it brought on by the war in Ukraine or amplified by this war and the new Cold War in China. So there's a whole bunch of new alignments and possibilities and consequences globally to all of us. Nora already said it. Prasanth, you're good with context, and we love context, and we need it. So can you do us the favor and explain a bit historically first, the historical process of what are the relations between India, Russia, China, US, to understand a little bit how we got to where we are now, and then we can try to see whether this historical context doesn't help us a little bit understand better what's going on in the here and now. Because sometimes that gets forgotten and we just talk about current events as if they happen out of nowhere. So take it away and explain to us how it all works. Thank you.
That's a very, very complicated question, but I shall try my best, which is really going to be difficult. But yes, so I mean, if you look at the broader, even if you look at some of these countries in terms of India, the United States, Russia, China, all of these, of course, massive countries, like you said, large populations, huge motors of the economy in various ways, and also countries which have, over time have developed very sophisticated foreign policy perspectives based on their history as well. So we know that in both India and China, of course, had a very difficult path in the 30s and 40s towards achieving true independence. We know that the Soviet Union, of course, much before Russia was in the picture, the Soviet Union had its own revolutionary process, which very strongly influenced its foreign policies as well, same with China. And we also know, on the other hand, that the United States has, from the time of its founding almost, I mean, the Monroe Doctrine was just a few decades after it was founded. And from that time onwards, focused on a very imperialist foreign policy. And that has really been carried. That's been so much a part of its foreign policy and its thinking that it's very difficult to separate the two. So all of these powers have had very complicated relationships with each other. I think an important way to understand a lot of the politics in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and East Asia, especially, is to look at it from the prism of the anti-colonial struggles that took place, through decades, and for that matter, even Africa, for that matter. It took place through decades in the 20th century, and the support the Soviet Union and China at various points provided to many of these struggles as well. And this led to, of course, what we, often people know of it as non-alignment, countries like India taking a pioneering role in following that path. And non-alignment is often, I think, very sort of narrowly understood as neutrality or whatever. We'll come to that a bit more, but it is much more richer than that. It stemmed from a notion of solidarity, it stemmed from a notion of struggles, and it was a much more richer policy. But I think for the immediate context, what makes sense is the more recent time period of, say, let's take 40 years, which itself is a huge time period. We know that the Soviet Union collapses, neoliberalism becomes the rule of the world. Many countries which are essentially far more socialist in their economic policies, and for that matter, in terms of their foreign policies, in terms of having good relations with both sides, started completely going over to the US and European way of thinking about things in terms of working. And India was actually one of those countries, because we see from 1990 onwards, on the one hand, India, these two go hand in hand. There's this policy of liberalization of the economy. The economy opens up. There's more private sector in the economy. There is, a huge amount of, Western influences that come on the one side. On the other hand, there is there's more proximity to the United States. There's more proximity to Israel, for that matter. And there is an attempt to sort of be part of that. There's an attempt to sort of be part, have that kind of a relationship where, you're far closer to the US aims. And this process has been further accelerated in the past 15 years or so. Like every 5 years, you take a look at India's position, you'll see that it has actually moved much closer to the US, right? So in fact, India is one of the countries which has sort of signed 3 defense operational agreements with the United States. It has gone very closely with various US strategic initiatives in the region. If you look at the Quad, for instance, if you look at, say, something like AUKUS, it's not directly involved. It is, at various points of time, it is, because it is very full-heartedly joined in the encirclement of China that the United States has sort of pioneered. So keeping all these things in mind, we see that until now, there have been exceptions. India and China have engaged at various points of time. India has had a very good relationship with Russia, despite the fact that Russia kind of was in a weak position in the 90s and the early 2000s. India always had a good economic relationship with Russia. and even a foreign relationship, there was something called the BRICS, which India, Russia, South Africa, and China all came together. But one of the defining moments, as far as India has been concerned in recent times, has been this move towards the United States. There was a famous Indo-US nuclear deal from 2005, 2007, 2008 onwards, which caused a lot of internal political chaos in the country. So keeping all this in mind, it's a long and maybe kind of difficult trajectory to sort of bring together. But what's very important is that there has been cooperation with Russia. There have been sort of attempts to work together with China at various points of time, and these have been also the hostility between these countries has prevented a lot of these attempts. But in recent years, one of the defining narratives has been India's very strong, proximity to the United States, and this is just taking these 3 or 4 big countries. So once we bring in Southeast Asia and South Asia, it becomes even more complicated.
Thank you. I think this is a very important, point of departure to understand what is happening now. Right now, like we see that people are using this expression Cold War again to describe this new situation. This Cold War also is a mentality, shows also a battle of ideas. Those abstract words that we all hear all the time from Western media and leaders, like our values, freedom, democracy. All this tends to simplify also the analysis of what's going on, as well as sending one very difficult message that is like there are only 2 options that are possible. But when you are talking about history, we have to also remember that in the Cold War, in the last Cold War, there weren't only 2 options, right? And also, if we remember, just in April, when the UN suspended Russia's membership of the Human Rights Council, 93 countries voted in favor, 24 against, and 58 abstained. So that brings us a different map that what maybe media and all the leaders are saying, like very straightforward and only one way of thinking about stuff, right? And also, this narrative that we hear in the West is repeating the message, a very polarized message. Like, if you are not supporting what the US and NATO are doing, you are, like a pro-Putin person. So this framework has been very tough for all peace movements, trying to articulate the struggle for peace and against NATO. But if we are also, again, in the Cold War, we have to remember this non-alignment movement, these BRICS, these other options that happened also at the same time during the last Cold War. So I think that lately people have been thinking about that. And also somehow things are happening in different ways. As you were saying, like relations in Asia are difficult, but I don't know, like also after Afghanistan, like the US backed up from Afghanistan, we saw like Central Asia, relationships, talking about what to do next. So these kind of things are going on. And Asia is one of the big also engines of the world. So we would like to hear more on how is in different regions of Asia, but also Africa or Latin America, these shifts that are happening, these difficult balances, positions, and also repercussions of not being fully in line with Biden. Maybe this is the end of globalization. More national and regional projects are beginning. And also, are these possible steps meaningful to peace?
Right. So that's a very interesting question, because I think, if you read the Western media, and unfortunately, because of my job, I had to do a lot of that. One of the problems that, you kind of see is that, like you were saying, it's such a uniform, story about what's happening, in Russia and Ukraine on one hand, and what is happening across the world. It's like, there are 2 ways of there are 2 aspects that the focus is. First, the focus is clear that the media kind of Western media kind of pretends that everyone is clear on the same page on what this war is about. And point number 2, they kind of give the impression that if any country is not subscribing to the US or European policies on the war, they're just being difficult, or they're being selfish, or they're being petty and economically minded, as opposed to the larger principled notions that supposedly the Western countries has. So apparently the Western countries are fighting for the great principles of democracy and human rights, and anybody who opposes them, not just Russia, any other country who's not fully on their side is basically a selfish country. If you boil down a lot of the stories you see in the media, that's really what it comes down to. And that is actually an extremely dangerous and unfair and unjust understanding of how this world functions. The fact that, countries in Asia, countries in Africa, they have a long tradition of, which is what I was mentioning earlier also, of resisting US and Western pressure on many such similar issues, and the fact that they also have a long history of working together on such issues built on a series of principles that are very rooted in economic reality, but are not just basic selfishness, so to speak, which is how it's often portrayed. So I think that's a very important thing to sort of remember. I mean, we've seen this map, I guess, where if you actually look at the total number of countries that have agreed to sanctions on Russia, they're a very small component of the global map, right? But they get an outsized proportion of media attention. That's a different thing. But there are actually a very small number of countries on the global map, which across the world, which have actually agreed to sanction Russia. And for most of these countries, the reasons are pretty clear because, their people are hungry. Their economies are often in doldrums. It's an interconnected world. Countries need to work with each other. There's a long history of countries working with each other despite disputes. And that is the basis on which the world runs. So countries in Asia and Africa do not see the sense of these wide-ranging sanctions imposed on Russia, which are basically affecting everyone's economy, which are basically affecting, say, struggling people in Afghanistan, struggling people in Sudan, struggling people in India, for that matter, in various ways because of issues like food inflation. So, if you look at it in terms of global positions, like I said, you've seen this in terms of the votes, the number of countries which have actually either abstained or refused to vote with the United States. You can look at countries like India, which have consistently refused to vote against Russia in many of these votes, in many of these votes at global forums because they disagree with it. All these countries in India, in Asia, in Africa, they've called for peace. No one is saying that, let the war continue, etc., etc. They've called for peace, but at the same time, they've also been very clear that the way the West has responded is really not the way to go about doing things. And for instance, we know that in India's case, it has purchased in recent times a huge amount of oil from Russia because now they're getting it at discounted rates. So although Russia in the past was a relatively, they didn't get so much oil from Russia, now they've increased that a bit. And, the Indian ministers have gone about in various places making very, strong remarks against the European and US line of thinking. Now, let's be very clear that this Indian government is in no way an angel or anything of that sort. It has an extremely problematic record in every aspect of, running the country. There's hardly any aspect you can take where it's not there. But nonetheless, the fact is that the global circumstances have pushed even this government, which is very pro-US. Right. So there have been multiple instances of India's foreign minister. I mean, there was an instance of India's prime minister hugging Trump, almost going in the US and making statements which indicated that he wanted Trump to win the 2020 elections. And we've had a huge amount of India-US diplomacy, but even this government has been forced to sort of take a stance and say that, we cannot agree with with these kind of sanctions. They don't make sense for us. We import fertilizers from Russia. We import oil from Russia. We import, say, weapons for that matter. There's a huge amount of arms imports that come from Russia to India as well. So all these factors have been one aspect of it. The second aspect also, I think, is something you were alluding to about Afghanistan. The fact that when Afghanistan crashed and the United States left, the countries in the region basically had to take the effort and try to sort of rebuild Afghanistan, right? So the countries in the region, they have huge problems with each other. India and Pakistan have a decades-long conflict. India and China have a decades-long conflict. At various points, relations with many of these partner countries have been problematic. But there is some kind of an attempt for all these forces to sort of try to work together, to try to sort of see if the situation in Afghanistan can be, at least to some extent, stabilized. And this is not just happening in Afghanistan. For instance, if you look at West Asia, you see the same thing with respect to Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Iran and the UAE. Now, these are countries which have for decades been at each other, been at opposing positions. They've been in opposing positions in the war in Yemen and so many other cases. But we do see that nonetheless, there is some amount of negotiations taking place between all these countries where all of them realize that we have differences, but if the region has to sort of sustain, if it should not collapse into complete lawlessness, we have to establish some kind of working relationship, right? So I think those are the kind of relationships that are increasingly sort of going to become very integral in the future. We have a much more advanced and progressive version of this maybe in Latin America, where countries that are influenced, movements influenced by Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. In the 2000s, they established a number of these institutions which are very progressive in nature, which bring a different agenda. So that's a very advanced example. I mean, I don't think Afghanistan, Central Asia, or West Asia has actually reached there. We have the African Union, for instance, there is a historic, great relationship starting from the Organization of African Unity, but the African Union itself has now been affected considerably by how French imperialism, how US imperialism has functioned in the region, the military bases, the struggle over minerals. So I think in various parts of the world, there are a lot of these projects which are sort of they're kind of budding. If you look at Southeast Asia, there's RCEP. It's a huge trade agreement. China, Southeast Asian countries, it's massive. Japan, South Korea, traditional allies of the US, but it's a huge, huge project, the biggest trading bloc in the world. So I think there are a lot of these interesting projects which are coming together, and it's still very early on to say how each of these will progress and whether they will actually acquire a more ideological perspective as well, and whether they will be able to set the agendas as opposed to merely responding to it. That's really, I think, the key question. How much will any of these blocs be able to set the agenda? In Latin America, they were able to, which is really one of the interesting things about it. But whether in many of these other regions they will be able to is really the question. In order to set the agenda, the US has to be out of the picture. Let's be very clear about it. Because as long as the US with its 800 military bases is in the picture, there is no way that there is going to be a coherent and harmonious regional grouping. Because it will just be for the strategic aims of the US, which is easy, where they want to pull one country against another.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Going back to the military part, when we started out with the show, in one of the first episodes, we were talking about the fact that NATO is sort of like the Trojan horse that brings US interests into Europe, or shares it among NATO state members, etc., like not only in Europe. Now, of course, India is not likely to join NATO anytime soon, but of course, military alliances exist, and they're not just centered around this North Atlantic. Not that the North Atlantic treaty organizations are even staying in their region, as we know out of the experiences mentioned here a number of times now in Afghanistan, out of area operations. There is other arrangements, and you were just talking about how the US sort of needs to be out of the region in order for this region to even coalesce and work together. So what happened with AUKUS that India is also not a part of, and that would have been, I guess, it would have been first bet strategic partner in this. So is the US actually missing the boat and creating tension in the region, and by exclusion of a big player like India, because on their road to China, I don't know, conflict with China or Cold War with China, trying to was it a blunder, or what happened? What happened with AUKUS?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't see AUKUS is intended to specifically include India as much as exclude India, as much as the fact that it's kind of complementary to the Quad. So the Quad is both these projects kind of go hand in hand, and both of them are basically part of the larger attempt to sort of encircle China, as we talked about. And this is it is one of those projects which it's so blatant in some senses, because your question always really is that why is the United States in the Indo-Pacific region at all? Why is the United States in Southeast Asia? They really have absolutely no interests over there, right? And this, in recent times, we've seen a lot of activity around this, because there was a Quad summit. Joe Biden was in South Korea and Japan. We've seen that the Japanese government, for instance, has taken a very different stance as opposed to India. We've seen that the Japanese government has gone completely in support of the US strategy in the region. They have sort of really escalated tensions with Russia. They have border issues of their own. They've taken a very harsh stance. They kept pushing this agenda that China is going to escalate the military situation in the region. They've imposed sanctions. So Japan has been a very, very hawkish government in recent times, extremely problematic. We've seen that there's a new South Korean government, which is also quite right wing, quite militant in its approach. Tensions are rising in the Korean Peninsula as well. Recently, China and Russia vetoed in the UN Security Council a resolution on sanctions on North Korea. So the US is up to its really, the US and its allies are really up to their regular pursuits in the region, which is really problematic and dangerous because there's so many military flashpoints in this region. There are already so many existing disputes and conflicts between countries in the region which can be mediated. It's not that it can't be mediated. There just has to be an effort. There has to be procedures. There has to be forums. But the moment a foreign, and a completely different power comes in and tries to sort of do this whole thing of these are our allies and you are the enemy, then all the disputes that are there, all the issues that are there, just gather an extra edge. The escalation increases much more. At this point, China and Russia also working very closely to each other, so they're also in a position where you see, for Russia, for instance, or for China, they have a legitimate stake in this issue. It's their borders. It's if Russia and Japan have a border dispute, it's because they're neighboring countries. So that's different from the US getting into the picture. So keeping that aside, what we're basically seeing is that there is through AUKUS, through the Quad. When Biden came in, he brought in what is called the economic aspect to all this, which is something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is a very loose set of deals, really no clarity on what it's supposed to, how it's really going to benefit the countries in the region. But it just serves as the economic arm of the US strategy in the region. So the US is not part of the RCEP, which I was mentioning, the huge trade bloc. So they're sort of somehow trying to get into that as well. So keeping all this in mind, what we're seeing is a consistent attempt, like I said, to encircle China, to encircle Russia in its own way, to sort of almost, I think, foment some of the existing tensions in the region, just so that this kind of encirclement process can continue, which is really the unfortunate thing, because you have the South China Sea, you have the Kuril Islands, you have just India-China border disputes, India-Pakistan have a dispute. There's so many issues that are there, and all of these are at further risk. So this is broadly the situation we are at, and it's extremely dangerous. And it is kind of unfortunate that governments in the region have completely given into this. For instance, the Indian government, it really had no reason to sort of, go all the way on the US line. There were no real benefits. It is not that the Indian, which is the other interesting thing, right? Like, what really are you greatly benefiting out of this? Like, India and the US have a good trade relationship, but that's not particularly because India goes completely on the US line. That'll continue. So, and India also has good trade relationships with so many other countries. In fact, if you look at India's trading partners, so many of it, so there's not so much in Europe. So many of them are in China as a major trading partner, Southeast Asia, West Asia. These are really the major partners. So there is no logic for the Indian government to go wholeheartedly in the US camp as it was doing all these years, and as it is still inclined to do. Let's be clear about that. So right now it's not, and it's a good thing, but it's still very much inclined to do that. So I think for a lot of countries in the region, this is a very important question they need to ask, that where are our interests? Are our interests, in associating with a far-off country which is out to create strife, or are our interests in working together with our neighbors, which is difficult, no doubt about it. You can't solve it with force. But in the long run, it's definitely much better if you're able to do that, because that really releases the potential of all the countries in the region, right? So I think that is a choice which governments need to take more seriously, which they need to ask themselves more seriously, and only then will these groupings we talked about in the last question have any genuine meaning beyond economic adjustments or responding to crisis. It's only when that mentality, that mindset, that strategy comes into place that these groupings will really have a very powerful existence.
Yeah. And also, there is another component that you are an expert on, that is also the perception of everything, not only from as government as defending economic interest, because maybe somehow everything that you've been talking is linked to the elections of 2024. Like, let's stop this crisis because I don't want another disaster, right? So, uh, removing the economic part, talking about perception, and also from more like I don't know, the population point of view, how this is related, also this perception, the people perception with the media process of addressing all these questions that for sure is not only in Asia and in Africa. Like that question that you were just saying, it's very urgent in Europe as well. Like we all need to question ourselves, what are our interests, what we are defending, who are our neighbors, like etc. But in fact, that India is not falling in line with the US desire to sanction Russia and cut ties has been noted in the Western media, for example. That's something that is noted. But without context, it seems like to be very little understanding of why this is happening, right? We would like to help to understand the reasons of this, because it's not only in India, but as you were saying, in other countries. Maybe it's because, I don't know, when Biden is talking about all values, all those countries are not represented, or maybe they have a better memory of history from the 90s, or another understanding also of the dimension of imperialism. Like people, they get confused when suddenly the media is talking about Russia being imperialist. Like maybe these kind of things are taken differently in other places of the world. But maybe also the media is more progressive, or the censorship against media in Russia is different from the global north. So I don't know. Maybe it's an important also ingredient to push, all these questions to go broader into the population. So what's the role of the media there? Because I don't know. Here sometimes we tend to think that what's going on here, it's homogeneous everywhere, and it's obvious that it's not. So please elaborate on the perception there.
Right. I think there are 2 points to this. One is, if you look at a general popular sentiment, it's a bit difficult to define, especially in South Asia and Africa, maybe. What I would say is that I think I'll come to the media separately. What I'd say is I think that there is, in general, far more skepticism towards, among many sections, I wouldn't say everybody, among many sections towards some of these US policies and European policies, because of history, because of the things you've grown up hearing, because of say over social reasons, a variety of reasons. So what you saw in Europe basically is that, or what you, in fact, I think you saw that probably mostly in Europe, where there was a sudden polarization of public opinion. I don't think that's really the case in any other part of the world, because I think people in other parts of the world are far more skeptical towards many of these bits of agenda. They're far more skeptical towards sort of attempts to make this a very simple narrative of the United States saving the world, etc., etc. So that I think is a very important thing to note. India, I would definitely say, is one of those countries where there is a lot of right-wing and far right-wing culture. Maybe is on the ascendant, maybe almost it has to some extent a hegemony. But even so, I think some of the remains of, say, history continue. Maybe it's some of, there's an inherent skepticism of the United States. So that agenda is really not sort of worked. I think from what we talked to our friends in countries like South Africa too, it's been very similar. Another important role in this, in this whole opinion building among people is mass organizations, is people's organizations, political parties, trade unions, those organizations which have a rich history of struggle and which have always identified the struggle against US imperialism as part of their struggles as well, even if their struggles are far more local or grounded. The fact that they've always identified those the struggles against imperialism as part of their struggles. So I think in many places where trade unions remain strong, where people's movements remain strong, and let's be clear, we're not talking about NGOs here. We're talking about people's movements and trade unions and political parties of the left, for instance. In many places where they have remained strong, I think they have been able to sort of also say imbue society with that, or people or general population with some of those ideas. And this basically means that these ideas do not disappear completely from uh, popular consciousness. So the notion of imperialism, the question is, on an average in Europe, how much does it come up is really a question, right? Whereas I think in countries in the South, in South Asia, in Africa, where there's a long history of anti-colonial struggles, it's a far more common term. It's a far more, say, very much a part of your consciousness, so to speak. So that's one aspect of it. Now, let's go to the media. Now, I'll talk about India specifically. India, unlike Nora, what you said, India does not have a progressive media by and large. India's dominant media is not even what you would call liberal. It is often the dominant media, especially in the TV section, is rabidly right-wing. It has some of the most vicious, one of the most vicious media cultures in the world. There's a lot of excellent journalism that takes place among many organizations, but there's also very vicious and violent media culture that India has, which is quite staggering when you look at what happens outside. But keeping that in mind, a lot of the Indian media from early on itself has been taking a much more skeptical stance towards the United States again. Now, there could be many reasons for this. Reason number one is the fact that they realize that the political establishment that they're closely sort of associated with is taking that line. So they feel the imperative to sort of, echo that line and to make it palatable to as many people as possible. There is definitely the realization that the talking points that are part of this anti-US line are very popular among people. So there have been a number of instances where, some of these major anchors have taken, have shouted it, or have made these big speeches against the United States, and those have been very popular. So there is also the understanding that these are good for ratings, so to speak. So that's definitely one factor as well. But broadly, if you look at, if you forget TV and if you look at the media, it's the general listing is that one, there's some skepticism of the US strategy. Two, there is also the accepting of the fact that India needs to take care of its own interests. India needs to take care of its own agenda, and that's also very much part of the media understanding. So, without being progressive, without being particularly, this thing, say a liberal, or if that matter, even liberal in any particular way, nonetheless, there has been far more openness to the issue in the Indian media than one would have thought possible, because generally you would expect that the media is one of those institutions which takes the Western line the quickest, because there's so much exposure to global media as well. But in this case, it really hasn't done so. Is there more it could do? Definitely, in terms of mainstreaming some of these ideas that we've been talking about now, pushing the government more on its pro-US policies. Just because it hasn't voted against Russia does not mean that it is going back to the age of non-alignment or anything of that sort. So that's very much there. So these are, I think, questions for the media to answer. I don't know, the Indian media, many sections of the Indian media not known for their introspective nature, sadly. So it's an open question as to whether they'll be, whether these issues will actually be addressed. So yeah.
I know we're running a little bit over time, but
Sorry.
No, that's not. I wanted to ask whether it's okay. I would like to dig deeper on one of these issues that has been come up in every question a tiny bit more, because I think that would probably be like the lesson to be learned today. So just to sum this up, so there's lots of reports that agree that we are heading into a very tough time. The International Monetary Fund has announced that the global economy is entering a major slowdown. Inflation rates have reached historic levels. Oxfam has sounded the alarm that we are witnessing the most profound collapse of humanity into extreme poverty and suffering in memory. There's fears of scarcity. We've talked about we've seen reports on increase of hunger. There is, all of this is happening while we are on a trajectory to ecological collapse, which we are not even talking about anymore, because suddenly we are thinking that a war is the way to go. So all of this combined could, of course, make one think that this decision by the Indian government, you pointed out already that A, that doesn't mean that they're suddenly not pro-US. It B, doesn't mean that, neutrality, or let's even not call it neutrality, that voting no on sanctions is enough. Or that, and this is, I think, what I'd like to get to, that the interests of the Indian government are the interests of the Indian people. So I think this is a contradiction that we should be looking at a little more closely, because it seems at times, as we've also seen in the show, the weird dichotomy that is made up just of these two options, and suddenly it looks like, yes, India, it's a progressive country. Things are looking up, and certainly the people's movements will align behind Modi and the government because now their interests are the same. So how do we deal with this contradiction that it might seem like the immediate interests are aligned, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no manifestation of class interests at work here. I think that this piece of analysis would be really useful for us to understand, because it can be applied to many situations, but also many places. And it challenges us to figure out, when we are interpreting these geopolitical situations, it challenges us to not fall into this trap, as you've pointed out, in Europe, and the entire, suddenly Europe speaks with one voice. How is that possible? And so maybe we can, that is definitely our last question, because I know it's also complicated, but maybe this is something that we can sort of work out a little tiny bit more, or you can help us work this out a little tiny bit more, just to make sure that we don't fall into these traps quite so easily. And I think in India, it is again interesting, because the government and the resistance to this government has been strong. We talked about the farmer strike in the beginning. Like, India is not suddenly all aligned. So what do the people's movements and the organizations do? How do they deal with this contradiction? I think this would be a super good ending to this exploration. Thank you.
Right, Francis. So actually, that's a very important question, and I think it kind of boils down to the question of, how do we understand this Indian government's current position? Like I said, it is a position that is important right now in the world. There's no doubt about that. It is a position that offers other countries also a possibility to sort of take a similar position, because when a big country like India takes it, it helps some of the others do it as well, right? So, and it has definite concrete implications in terms of, say, strategic issues, in terms of economic issues, in terms of production. So all that is definitely there. Now, that said, I think people's movements, the left, for instance, has a much more broader and different take on even the government's position on this issue, which is that, it does not sort of just boil down to what India's foreign policy is often termed strategic autonomy. Right. So, strategic autonomy is, you remain broadly autonomous. You take whatever side that sort of suits your perspective or suits your interests at that particular point of time. And then you sort of claim that you're looking after your interests, so nobody should question you, which is pretty much what the Indian government's stance has been, that, the comments by various ministers indicate that they're like, you can't judge us for instance, they tell the Europeans, you continue to buy Russian energy supplies. Why are you sitting and judging us? Or, that has been the broad response. And they keep saying that this is in the interest of India, so we're doing this. Now, I think the left, people's organizations have a much more broader perspective on this issue, and they're in fact critical of, their point is very clearly that strategic autonomy is not enough. Strategic autonomy is basically it's a kind of approach that does not leave you anywhere, that does not leave you in good, strong institutions, that does not base your approach on the real concrete economic needs of your people. And so a strategic autonomy is based on, it is not based on an attempt to sort of, build long-term, strategies for the growth of your people. So these, of course, seem a bit vague, but let's be a bit more specific on this in terms of when you're looking at India's economic strengths, how is India sort of working with its neighbors, working with various countries across the world to sort of leverage its own economic strengths and those of other countries and build those kind of ties, right? That's really the question. So, for to answer that question, you need a far more you need a much more different approach from the Indian government than what it is doing right now. Because right now, the Indian government's foreign policy approach is very erratic. It is very personality driven. It is very defensive. It cannot take even the slightest bit of criticism of its policies from anybody else. And we saw all of this in the farmer struggle last year because the moment any celebrity from the West tweeted about the farmer struggle, the Indian government got very upset. And this sort of coincides with the fact that it is extremely repressive government at home in every sense of the term. So, as far as the left and progressive movements are concerned, I don't think that this is a question really of, say, of there being an alignment with that of the government. I don't think that's the case. So it's not an alignment per se as much as the fact that what the government has taken is one small step in what should be a much larger and diverse and ground and long-term approach. And this is what the left has been saying for decades. It has been saying that you cannot be part of uh, the Western blocs. You should not be part of the Quad. You should not engage so closely with AUKUS. You need to have good relationships with your neighbors, and you need to promote self-reliance and scientific research and production within your own country, so that you are not just a service sector economy, which influences foreign policy. And for the fact that you need like institutions like BRICS, they provide a true blueprint for the future if all the countries are truly invested in that, right? So you need to invest in BRICS, you need to invest in the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, you need to build close ties with ASEAN. All of this keeps getting disrupted because of India's own the way the government works domestically, which is one of repression, which is of following a Hindu majoritarian agenda. It encourages that. All that together makes a good foreign policy very difficult. So I think not just for India but for any part of the world, there might be situations where the left and progressive movements and the government are right now saying the same thing on Russia and Ukraine, but they come from very different places. And I think it's very important for the peace activists, for the left, to sort of make that very clear that, okay, the government is saying a good thing right now, but these are the problems in what they're doing. This is just one part of it. It's a much more larger and more powerful policy approach that you need to do. And that, I think, is a key imperative for people's movements right now.
I was thinking, Prasanth, that like we should be watching this video again, like this all your last part, and change in our mind when you were talking about India and Asia, talking about Europe, because I think this is a huge message that we are sending here. Like from last question from Francisca, you have to talk to your neighbors because you live with them. You need to think through what are your needs as a country, what are the needs of your people, and how to also develop your technology, your areas, how to you build this sovereignty in all aspects, right? Because
Exactly,
what
exactly.
Francisca was talking is that a lot of countries, they are deciding to stop exporting because they have to, they are concerned that their own people won't be able to eat. So all this is connected to peace, as you were saying, Prasant, when the approach on those decisions are embedded with a political understanding of solidarity, of internationalism, and of peace. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thanks to for providing us with information like is necessary, and also explaining like the movements that are taking place in the global south, because if not are only like unconnected pieces, and we can also
Right.
don't reflect on also what we have to do in a global perspective. um, Today we invite you again to read and follow the international work that People's Dispatch always produces, with this social grassroots perspective and also with the voices from the real international community. So this war in Ukraine is not only a European crisis. We are part of a very dangerous geostrategic path, which is advancing militarily towards China, that would mean a major confrontation. That is going to be one of the major discussions that are going to follow this NATO summit that we are going to discuss in Madrid. And also, in the face of the alliance of war that NATO means, today is more urgent than ever the great alliance for peace to address together what is really important, that are the lives and needs of the people. We hope to see you all on the Peace Summit against NATO and wars in Madrid from the 24th to the 26th of June, to think and debate together, to have all these ingredients in our head, but also not to only sound very clever, but also to articulate ourselves and to face up to our common challenges. So peace is a priority. Let's talk together. See you next Saturday. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Prasanth.
you. Thank you so much.